So welcome to this second video on coaching with real issues using CoachMaster software. If you haven't seen that first video, it's available on YouTube, and what Jane arrived at as an overall goal was to be able to give mentoring to her colleagues and not be overtly affected by what they were thinking. And we discussed how that was not a completely clear goal, but it was probably clear enough for the purposes of the session, since Jane would have a clear enough idea of whether she achieved it or not. So now we move on to the session goal. The purpose of the session goal is to clarify what the client wants as of working with you, the coach, in the session. It's not a new goal itself. It's a subsection of the main goal to find out what the client wants out of the session. Usually it's a plan for how to achieve the overall goal, but sometimes the client may want some advice or other things as well. So I find it useful to check. Some coaches are quite happy to leave it out. As you can see from the discussion, Jane is quite happy to get a plan to how to achieve her overall goal. So now we've established the session goal, we can move on to the current reality. Now there's a very common misunderstanding when people first start to use the GROW model that current reality, the R of GROW, is a way of testing whether the goal is realistic or not. And I think that's a misapprehension. The way I would describe current reality is the measure of how far away the client is from achieving the goal that they want. So in Jane's case, she's told me that her goal is to be able to give mentoring to her colleagues and not be overly affected by what they are thinking. So in the current reality section, what I'm going to be trying to find out is what happens at the moment. So I select this question and adapt it to the information and language that Jane has given me so far. I should say at some points I will be showing you me doing the adaptation. At other points I'll just paste the text straight in so you don't have to put up with my bad typing. So Jane comes back with some information that when she gives advice and somebody doesn't agree with her advice, she starts to feel that they think she's stupid. So again, we've got some potential mind reading and some pretty clear indications that she's making what other people think more important than her own judgment and perception. So I ask the next question from the frequency tab if she has that particular reaction every time somebody questions what she's suggesting. She tells me she doesn't, and I try this classic awareness question of asking about the differences when something works or something happens and something doesn't happen to see what information Jane can give me. And she tells me that it happens because she knows in some senses it's not the best solution, but she doesn't have a better one. So what I was thinking about this point is that Jane was putting a lot of pressure on herself to come up with the perfect solution. So I tried a question where I took Jane's thinking and pushed it out a bit to the extreme, hoping it would help us see that this wasn't a particularly helpful way of thinking. And Jane does acknowledge that that is in fact correct. So I'm hoping that will be a little awareness moment for her. So at this point, I thought we had enough information to summarize the current reality statement using Jane's own words and move on to obstacles. Now, I would hold my hands up at the moment and say that in classic GROW theory, the current reality statement should be in exactly the same terms as the overall goal, so you know how far you are from it. And I think we've deviated a bit from that, but I felt it was more important to follow Jane's process in the session and see where that led us. And we arrived at a statement of current reality that I was reasonably happy with, and so was she. So we moved on to the obstacle section, and pretty quickly I decided that this second section of questions here about obstacles within the client would be the best way to start, since everything Jane had told me indicated it was very much her internal experience that was causing the problem. So I started off almost asking Jane to recap about what personal patterns or characteristics she might have that are helping contribute to her feeling stuck. And interesting enough, Jane comes back with her tendency to mind read, but says she believes she's often right, which, funnily enough, I also believe I'm often right when I'm doing mind reading. And Jane also gives me the information that she cares a lot about what people think of her at work. So we're picking up a picture here of somebody who cares a lot about what they do, but is also very sensitive to perceived or actual criticism. And I think this is one of the interesting things that you can do with e-coaching, is sort of take time to reflect on what information you're getting about the person as a person. And while you do have time to do that, of course, in other types of coaching, the fact that it's written down and you have a bit of time to actually consider what the person has written, somehow for me makes it a bit easier to really get a picture of who they are. So my next question was to ask Jane to look at the fear a bit more directly by editing this question about what's the one fear that she doesn't want to face. And Jane comes back fairly directly to tell me her fear is that people will think she's not smart. So I now have a go at suggesting that this fear might be one thing that's holding her back. And Jane agrees with it. So while we're on a bit of a roll, I decide to ask if there's anything else that might be holding her back. The anything else question is really useful in the obstacles section, because very often a client will tell you the initial obstacle, but if you just ask them to reflect a bit deeper, very often they can come up with other obstacles that are also holding them back once they've started on that train of thinking. And Jane comes back with the information that she also wants to be liked, as indeed we all do at some level. But you can see how a very strong desire to be liked and a desire to be thought of as smart could really hinder Jane in her role as a manager. So I come back with an acknowledgement of Jane that she'd been very honest, which always is important to do, especially in e-coaching where you can get a bit robotic, just sending questions back and forward. It's really important to acknowledge the person, use empathy and understanding when they're being honest about a difficult situation. And decided to ask Jane if she had an expectation of how she should deal with the situation, on how the fear is being an obstacle for her in her objectives as a manager. Obviously not a very clear question, as Jane comes back and clarifies if that's indeed what I'm asking. And I come back with a sort of summarization of what I think the issue is. Jane comes back by sort of contradicting my exaggeration to some extent on the mind reading, and reiterates how important it is for her to be thought of as smart. And then very helpfully, she actually describes a couple of ways that she thinks she could deal with the situation to either become more knowledgeable and read more books, or to find ways of defeating, I think that should be the negative thoughts. So, as often happens when you use the GROW model, people give you part of a solution to one section when they're in another section. So here Jane is telling me some information that we may well be able to use in the options section, but we're still in the obstacle section. So I suggest putting that aside until we get to the options section, and then decide to check with her, since she's mentioned the extra knowledge, whether that or any other resources are things she might need. And Jane comes back quite quickly and tells me very clearly no. So I attempt to summarize the obstacle as Jane telling herself she has to have the perfect answer every time, which, as I'm sure some people might realize, is very close to the reality statement. But in this particular situation, I thought that because of the way the session had panned out, that it was okay to use a very similar statement for both the current reality and the obstacles. So again, using the drag and drop feature, I select Jane's words that summarize where her main obstacle is, and use the summarization feature of CoachMaster to post them into the obstacles tab, We then move on to the options and way forward sections, which I will cover in the next video.